The valley had not seen a single snowflake, and Clara Voss was already digging a room for winter under the mountain. Every blow of her quarry bar rang across Blacktail Ridge. The sound carried down through the pines, over the creek, and into the settlement of Marrow Creek, where people had already chosen a name for what she was building. A burial room. Clara called it a fuel vault. Most people called it proof that grief had finally broken her. She was 34 years old, alone on a homestead nearly 2 miles above the valley road, and working against a sky the color of forged iron. The fir branches did not move. No jays fought over seed near the porch. Even the mule kept turning its head toward the western ridge. The mountain was holding its breath. Clara set the point of the bar against the frozen bank and struck again. This time the crust split, only the width of a fingernail, but beneath it she could see the layer she had hoped for, dry clay packed around flat gray shale. The earth below the frost had not frozen solid. It had kept something, not heat exactly, something more useful. It had refused to waste it. Clara knelt and pressed her bare fingertips against the exposed clay. The air was bitter enough to sting her teeth. The soil was cold, but not dead cold. Not like the wind, not like the porch boards, not like the iron latch that burned her skin when she touched it. She closed her eyes. For a moment, Blacktail Ridge disappeared. She was 9 years old again, following her father into a low door cut into a bluff above Lake Pepin, Minnesota. Her family had stored potatoes, apples, lamp oil, and seed grain there. In July, the room stayed cool. In January, water left on the stone shelf formed only a thin skin of ice. Her father, Anders Voss, had held a candle beside the wall and watched the flame lean toward a narrow cedar vent. "The ground does not make warmth," he had told her. "It keeps the wind from stealing it." Clara had forgotten hundreds of things her father said. She had never forgotten that. Now the wind had taken nearly a cord of her firewood before winter had even begun. An October rain had soaked the outer rows. Then 3 hard freezes had welded the logs together. When she split one open, the heartwood smelled sour. Another had already begun to bloom with pale mold. She counted the remaining stacks 3 times, 2 3/4 cords, enough for a mild winter. Blacktail Ridge did not have mild winters. Her husband, Jonah, had always cut 6. But Jonah had been dead for 20 months. A snapped cable at the Pine Hook logging camp had killed him before anyone could carry him home. The company sent his boots, his pocket knife, and $43 in wages sealed inside an envelope. No apology, no pension, no winter wood. Clara had spent 1 season proving she could keep the claim without him. This season, the mountain intended to find out whether she had merely delayed the truth. That night, she spread flour sacking paper across the kitchen table and drew by lamplight. Not a cellar, not a mine shaft. A narrow chamber running 18 feet into the bank behind the cabin. A floor raised on flat shale, a drainage trench cut down the center. 2 cedar vents, one low near the entrance, one high at the rear, to keep air moving without letting the storm enter. A small hatch through the cabin wall so she could reach the driest wood without opening the outside door. She measured the slope with a mason's line Jonah had left in his tool chest. 1 inch of fall for every 4 feet. Enough, she hoped, to send seep water away from the stacks. She wrote 4 numbers in the margin. 18 feet, 6 feet wide, 5 feet high, 3 weeks. Then she stared at the last number until the lamp began to smoke. 3 weeks before the first deep freeze, if the old signs still meant what they had meant in Minnesota. 3 weeks to persuade a mountain to become part of her house. Before dawn, Clara put on Jonah's old canvas coat, wrapped her palms in wool, and drove the first iron point into Blacktail Ridge. By noon, Gideon Pike saw her from the freight road. Gideon built half the roofs in Marrow Creek and repaired the other half after every heavy winter. He turned his wagon uphill and stopped beside the growing cut. For a long time he said nothing. He looked at the iron bar, the pile of shale the rectangle Clara had marked in charcoal against the bank. Then he looked at her. "You are cutting into load-bearing ground. I know. It will shed water into the cabin. I am grading it away. It will trap damp. I am venting it." Gideon removed his hat and rubbed the scar above his temple. "What are you putting in there?" "Firewood." The answer changed his face. "Below ground?" "Inside the bank. Wood belongs under a roof. This will have one. It belongs in moving air. It will have that too. It belongs where you can see rot before it spreads. I will see every stack from the hatch." Gideon stepped closer to the opening. The cut was barely 2 feet deep, but the air inside already felt different. Still, dense, protected. He crouched and pressed his thumb against the clay. Then he stood. "I have pulled 3 families out of collapsed root cellars," he said. "I am not helping you build the 4th. I did not ask you to. No, you did not." He looked toward the cabin, then back at Clara. "That is the part that worries me." He drove away before sunset. By supper, everyone in Marrow Creek knew Clara Voss was burying her winter fuel. By Sunday, the story had improved itself. Some said she was building a tunnel to escape taxmen. Some said Jonah had appeared to her in a dream. One man at the livery claimed she planned to sleep underground with the wood because she no longer trusted the cabin. Clara heard none of it directly, but on Monday morning, she found a coil of tarred rope on her porch. Tied to it was a note from Ruth Calder, the valley midwife. "Use this for the roof braces. It holds when wet." At the bottom, Ruth had added one more line. "I expect to see smoke from your chimney in February." Clara folded the note and placed it inside Jonah's wage envelope. Then she went back to the bank. The first 6 feet came slowly. The next 4 came with danger. Once Clara passed beneath the frost line, the clay softened, but the shale began to loosen in plates. She cut each piece free with a hammer and cold chisel, lowered it by hand, and dragged it out on a grain sack sled. Every load weighed between 60 and 90 pounds. She counted because counting made exhaustion feel measurable. 41 loads the first day, 36 the next. On the third, her right palm split through the wool. She wrapped it in a strip torn from an old petticoat and kept digging. At 8 feet, she could no longer stand upright near the face. At 10, lantern smoke collected near the ceiling. That told her the rear vent could not wait. She bored upward with a long auger Jonah had used for fence posts, turning the handle a quarter circle at a time. The bit struck roots, then stone, then a pocket of loose gravel that poured down her sleeve. She kept turning. Just before dark, the auger broke through the slope above. The lantern flame bent toward the new opening. Clara smiled for the first time in days. The room had taken its first breath, but on the 11th night rain came. Not snow, rain. It struck the frozen slope for 6 hours and ran beneath the crust. By midnight, water began dripping through the unfinished ceiling. By 1 in the morning, a thin stream crawled along the wall toward the cabin foundation. Clara stood inside the chamber in her nightdress, boots, and Jonah's coat, holding a lantern over rising mud. Her drainage trench was too shallow. The bank was not protecting her. It was filling. For one terrible minute, Gideon Pike's voice became the only voice she could hear. It will shed water into the cabin. Clara looked at the water. Then, at the stacks still outside, shining black in the rain. If she abandoned the vault, she would lose the chamber. If she stayed inside and the ceiling let go, she could lose more than that. She set the lantern on a stone. Then she picked up the shovel. All night, Clara deepened the trench. She cut it lower than the cabin footing, widened the entrance channel, and lined the bottom with broken shale. Mud climbed past her ankles. Her wet braid froze against the back of her coat whenever she stepped outside to throw spoil downhill. Near dawn, the water changed direction. Not quickly, not dramatically. A thin stream found the trench, followed it, and slipped out beneath the entrance sill. Then another, then all of it. Clara sat down in the mud and watched the bank drain itself. The room had not failed. Her first design had. There was a difference. By sunrise, she had learned exactly what the mountain required in exchange for its protection. The next afternoon, Gideon returned. He saw the wash of mud, the deepened trench, and the wet tools scattered near the entrance. You nearly flooded your cabin. Yes. You still plan to finish. Yes. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he lifted a bundle of peeled lodgepole braces from his wagon. I cut these for a barn loft, he said. The barn can wait. Clara did not thank him immediately. She knew what the gift cost. Not money. Certainty. Together they set braces every 3 feet. Gideon taught her to notch the cross pieces so weight moved into the side walls instead of down the center. Clara showed him the 2-vent plan and the raised stone crib she intended to build beneath the wood. He did not call it foolish again. He also did not call it safe. Safe is something people say after spring, he told her. By the end of the 3rd week, the chamber reached 18 feet. Clara stood at the rear wall with the lantern raised. The floor sloped toward the entrance. 2 narrow vent shafts pulled air through the room. Flat shale formed a dry platform 6 inches above the trench. Cedar braces held the roof. A plank hatch, no wider than her shoulders, opened through the cabin's back wall. She had used 112 feet of rope, 27 braces, and almost every unwarped board left from Jonah's shed. The fuel vault looked less like a grave now. It looked like a machine built from dirt, stone, air, and patience. For 5 days, Clara moved wood. She tested each split log with the back of her hand. Dry pieces went nearest the cabin hatch. Damp pieces went toward the vented rear wall with space between the rows. Rot-softened wood stayed outside. When the final stack was loaded, the vault held 2 1/2 cords. Not enough to waste, enough to survive, if every part of the room worked exactly as intended. On December 3rd, the first real snow fell. On December 29th, the mercury outside Ruth Calder's window dropped to 18 below zero. On January 6th, it rose suddenly to 10 above. The elders in Marrow Creek disliked that more than the cold. A warm day in deep winter meant wet snow. Wet snow meant ice. And ice, followed by hard cold, could turn every exposed woodpile in the valley into a single frozen wall. The next morning, the mountain went silent. Clara woke before dawn because the cabin had stopped creaking. No wind pressed the logs. No snow slid from the roof. The mule did not stamp. She wiped frost from the window and saw the western sky sinking over the ridge like a sheet of dark metal. There you are. She filled every bucket. She carried oats inside for the mule. She trimmed 6 lamp wicks. She brought the axe and shovel into the kitchen. Then she opened the wall hatch. A breath of cool, earthy air touched her face. She reached for the first log. The split pine was dry. Not surface dry. dry enough that its bark crackled beneath her thumb. Clara placed it beside the stove and waited. At noon the snow began. By 2 it moved sideways. By 4 the valley road was gone. By nightfall, Blacktail Ridge had vanished inside the storm. The wind found every seam in the cabin and pushed. Snow packed against the door. Ice struck the roof like handfuls of gravel. Every 40 minutes, Clara opened the hatch, reached into the bank, and pulled out one dry split of pine. The fire took each piece immediately. No hiss, no steam, no smoke rolling backward into the room, just flame. On the second night, the outside temperature fell past 26 below zero. The oil in the lamp thickened. A tin cup left near the window froze solid. But the wall beside the vault hatch remained several degrees warmer than the north wall of the cabin. Clara knew because she had hung 2 mercury thermometers, one beside each surface. The north wall read 3 above. The vault wall read 11, 8 degrees. 8 degrees was not comfort, it was margin, and in a mountain winter, margin was another word for life. Down in Marrow Creek, the storm turned bad preparation into punishment. The Braddock family had covered their wood with canvas, but freezing rain had blown beneath it. Their logs smoked and spat in the stove. At the Vale cabin, a shed roof collapsed under wet snow and buried half a winter's fuel. Gideon Pike found his outdoor stack sealed behind a crust of ice 2 inches thick. He spent 3 hours breaking it with an axe before he could free 6 logs. By the 3rd day, chairs began disappearing into stoves, then fence rails, then shelves. The storm did not care whether a board held a roof, a memory, or a family Bible. It measured only what could burn. Inside Clara's cabin, the vault kept working, until just after midnight. Clara opened her eyes. Another knock came through the rear wall, then a faint scraping. She lit the lantern, opened the hatch, and crawled inside. 10 feet in, the flame changed. It stood straight, no pull toward the upper vent. Clara held one hand beneath the rear shaft. Nothing. The vent had stopped drawing. Without airflow, the dampest wood could begin to sweat. If moisture froze inside the chamber, every careful stack might become the same icebound mass she had tried to escape. She moved deeper. At the rear wall, frost had grown over the vent opening like white coral. Wind-driven snow had packed the shaft from above, then frozen. Clara reached for the auger. The first turn broke only surface ice. The second struck something solid. She braced both feet against the shale floor and leaned her whole weight into the handle. The packed snow above shifted. A roof brace moved. Not much. Half an inch. But Clara saw clay dust fall through the lantern light. She stopped breathing. If she forced the auger upward, the vent might clear. If the brace slipped, the rear 6 feet of the chamber could come down on top of her. Behind her sat the wood that kept the cabin alive. Ahead of her, the mountain waited for an answer. Clara backed out. For several seconds, she stood in the kitchen, staring at Jonah's old crosscut, saw hanging above the door. Then she took it down. She cut the kitchen table in half. The table had been the first piece of furniture Jonah built after they raised the cabin. One leg still carried the notch where he had tested his draw knife. Clara ran her thumb across that mark once. Then she carried both halves into the vault. She wedged one section beneath the shifting brace and used the other as a spreader against the sidewall. The ceiling settled onto the new support. Only then did she return to the auger. 1 turn, 2, 3. The blockage broke free. Snow burst down around her shoulders. The lantern flame bent hard toward the rear wall. The room breathed again. Clara sat on the shale floor, covered in clay and frost. listening to air move through the vault. She had saved the wood by cutting apart the table. For one sharp moment, grief rose in her throat. Then she looked at the brace holding the ceiling. Jonah's table was still doing what he had built it to do. It was holding up their life. At dawn on the 6th day, the wind stopped, not slowly. One moment the cabin shook. The next, silence filled every corner. Clara waited until noon before digging out the door. The world outside had lost its shape. Snow buried the fence. Only the upper half of the shed roof remained visible. Drifts reached the eaves of the cabin. But smoke rose from Clara's chimney in a straight blue line. She opened the vault. The wood remained dry. She counted what was left. 1.5 cords, more than half her supply. She should have rested. Instead, she filled a canvas pack with 12 split logs and started down the ridge on snowshoes. The trip to Marrow Creek usually took 40 minutes. That day, it took nearly 4 hours. At the Braddock cabin, she found Gideon Pike swinging an axe against frozen cordwood while Liza Braddock held a coughing child inside her coat. Gideon lowered the axe when he saw Clara. His eyes moved to the canvas pack, then to the clean smoke drifting from her clothes. He understood before she spoke. Clara carried the wood inside. The first log caught within seconds. The second threw enough heat to dry the third. By nightfall, the stovepipe had stopped dripping black water. Liza Braddock began to cry. Clara set 6 logs beside the stove and kept 6 in the pack. "I will bring more tomorrow." Gideon stared at the fire. "How much do you have left?" 1.5 cords, and you are giving it away? I am dividing it. That is not the same thing. No, Clara said. It is better. For 11 days, Clara moved dry wood down from Blacktail Ridge. Not enough to heat every cabin completely, enough to restart wet fires, enough to dry the next layer of fuel, enough to keep sick children, old lungs, and frostbitten hands from crossing the line winter. Never let people cross twice. When the road finally opened, Marrow Creek climbed to Clara's homestead. Not as a crowd, one family at a time. They brought coffee, nails, lamp oil, saw blades, and questions. Gideon brought a carpenter's level. Ruth Calder brought bread. The men who had joked about the burial room stood inside the bank and ran their hands over the dry pine. Clara showed them everything. The 18-foot depth, the 6-inch raised floor, the drainage fall, the low intake vent, the high rear vent, the braces set 3 feet apart, the spacing between damp rows. She also showed them the table cut in half beneath the rear ceiling. That part was not in the plan, Gideon said. No, Clara answered. That part was winter. By the following autumn, 7 homesteads had bank rooms cut behind their cabins. The year after that, there were 19. Some were smaller than Clara's. Some used stone arches. One family built theirs beneath a barn ramp. Gideon improved the brace joints. Ruth insisted every room have a second exit tool stored inside. Clara added wire screens to the vent tops after birds nested in one during spring. The design changed because people used it, but the principle did not. The ground did not make warmth. It kept the wind from stealing it. 5 winters later, a land surveyor passing through Marrow Creek sketched Clara's vault in his field book. He asked what the structure was called. Clara looked down the ridge. From where she stood, she could see smoke rising from more than 40 chimneys. "Call it a bank room," she said. "Why bank? Because you put work into it before winter," Clara replied. "And the earth gives that work back when the sky has nothing left to give." The surveyor wrote the name exactly as she said it, but the valley remembered something else. They remembered the sound of one woman striking frozen stone before the snow arrived. They remembered how certain they had been that she was digging a grave. And every hard winter after that, when ice sealed the sheds and wind erased the roads, the people of Marrow Creek opened small doors in the backs of their cabins and reached into the mountain for dry wood. The storm had taken the sky. The earth had kept the fire.